Good morning. I'm Reverend Dr. Suzanne Winona Duchesne, and I am the director of Mass Chapel at NBTS, as well as the visiting assistant professor of worship and preaching at New Brunswick Theological Seminary. Welcome to this day-long webinar, What's Next in Digital Worship? I hope that the creativity and innovative ideas I heard expressed in my planning meetings for this with our speakers will begin a new work in you that will continue to inspire and invite us to dive deeply into these new waters. And I trust that these deep dives can in turn birth new ideas in our congregations and in the minds of our leadership across all the denominations and local churches represented here today. I trust that this will be only the beginning of opportunities to grow and to learn from each other as our churches and ministries continue to shape and be shaped by online platforms and presence. To begin, I would like to introduce you to my colleagues who got this show started and who made it possible for all of us to be here today and provide this day-long event through our Vital Worship Grant for Worship in Communities, sponsored by the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship. First, I want to introduce Dr. Beth Tanner, who is our Vice President and Dean of Academic Affairs at New Brunswick Theological Seminary. She's also the Reverend Dr. Norman and Mrs. Mary Cansfield Professor of Old Testament Studies and is an ordained Presbyterian minister who served several Presbyterian churches in the U.S. She's authored 3 books and brings both her scholarship and her deep spiritual life to her work. And I am most grateful for her guidance as I've been navigating these new digital waters. Second, I want to present Dr. Faye Taylor, who is the director of the New Brunswick Theological School's New York campus and our director of field education. She is ordained in the African Methodist Episcopal Church and the presiding elder of the Kingston, Jamaica district of the Western New York Conference of the AME. And as if that is not enough, she is also serving a church while also holding positions on several boards devoted to the ministry with women and children. Her encouraging spirit and grace-filled leadership has been a source of strength as I develop digital worship services here at the seminary. Finally, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome back to NBTS Dr. Andrew Weimer. He's presently Assistant Professor of Liturgical Studies at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. But previous to this position, he was the chapel director here at NBTS, as well as the Professor of Preaching and Worship and the Chair of the Doctor of Ministry Oversight Committee at New Brunswick Theological Seminary. So in addition to his many academic honors, including his groundbreaking work as the co-convener of the Unmasking White Preaching Work Group at the Academy of Homiletics, he's also a most generous colleague and an advocate for emerging scholars. And I am greeting you today in large measure due to his recognition and encouragement of my work. So most important to us today is the integral part that he played in the award and implementation of this grant. So I'm going to turn the virtual room over to Dr. Weimer now to tell you more.
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Duchesne, for the introduction and the invitation to participate today. And I also want to express a word of gratitude to Dean Tanner and to Dr. Taylor for the privilege of engaging around today's event and the many fond memories that arise as we talk about this project. So just have to name, it's always good to be at New Brunswick Theological Seminary, even if only digitally. And as I prepared to be with you all this morning, I just have to be honest, I felt a bit of sorrow at not being able to be together on campus, in Mass Chapel, in New Brunswick, and in the physical presence of so many beloved persons. So today's event is the concluding event of a project funded by a Vital Worship Grant for Worship in Communities, sponsored by the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship and underwritten by Lilly Endowment. Before I continue, I'm sure that we all want to express our gratitude to Calvin for the funding and for the support of the Institute staff. And I want to encourage you, if you're working in a worshiping community, to make sure and visit the Institute's website to learn more about these grants. So I was invited to give a brief introduction about this event and how it situates within the life of our grant project. I'm going to share a bit of the history of this Vital Worship Grant project, some of the impacts it's had on the seminary, and then how that situates how we are here today. So Dean Tanner and Dr. Taylor and I worked together as the Seminary Worship Committee, I believe from 2018 to 2020. And we began conceptualizing this project in 2018. So over the course of, I think, roughly 2 months, we conversed and imagined about what was most necessary, what was possible to ensure that the worship life of MBTS remained vital. Through this process, we identified strengths, and we also identified growing edges. So we considered how over the past decades, the seminary had undergone such dramatic shifts in the composition of the student body. And these are dramatic shifts that are reflected in a number of institutions of theological education. So dramatic shifts in the composition of the student body, in the ways in which we offered theological education. These included from a primarily residential school to a commuter school, from day classes to night classes, from on-campus courses to hybrid and online courses, from younger students to second career students who study and work full-time, from weekday courses to weekend courses, from a single campus to 2 campuses, from a regionally confined student body to a national student body. So many dramatic shifts. And how could we keep up with that and account for that in our worship life? So we named how, in spite of our best efforts, the MBTS chapel services and worship life had become increasingly inaccessible with all these polls and all these restrictions. And even as we strove so hard to provide a worship life that met the needs of the community, we were struggling in light of all these challenges. So our goal in this project was to respond to these realities by helping the NBTS community to envision ways of rendering our then current worship life digitally accessible, and to create new supplementary resources for digital worship. Our hope was that this project would allow us to rethink when and how we hold our worship gatherings, and to free ourselves from some of the restrictions that had increasingly limited our worship life. So the first phase of this grant included, it was the fall of 2019, I believe. And it seems so long ago, y'all. Fall of 2019. And we started with the project with significant conversations in the community about our commonalities around worship, our assumptions about worship, and the possibilities of digital accessibility. And as part of this, we brought in some outside experts to consult with us on the technical and liturgical possibilities of online worship. And this first phase had been intended to set up a second phase starting in the spring of 2020 that would result in the implementation of a digitally accessible worship life at the seminary. But little did we know that COVID-19 would completely upend our world, resulting in so much institutional loss, as well as the compounding of so much social inequity. So little did we know that COVID-19 would also upend our worship and even our grant project. The human challenges were intense. The communal, the liturgical challenges were intense. So I think it's important to note that as we had written with this grant, we'd consulted with experts, we began implementing it, and not a dang person ever mentioned Zoom, y'all. Not to mention Zoom worship or Zoom church or anything like that. So, so many unexpected things have arisen. So, however, in light of that, in spite of that, excuse me, we had done the work of talking about and imagining how digital accessibility might impact our worship. While our technical plans, the purchase equipment and such were instantly just not feasible because we couldn't be in Mass Chapel, we conversed deeply about possibilities. We had some communal awareness of and openness to digital possibilities. So we were ahead of the curve in a sense. And just like many other pastors and churches and seminaries, we were also unprepared and in shock amidst so much disruption and distancing. and loss. So we had to reimagine possibilities, rework our plans, all while the world was going to hell in a handbasket. So I think it's important to name how fast we've come. It has been far and fast. I don't know about y'all, but I'm amazed at the innovation that I see occurring today in worship and ministry. I'm also weary. I assume that I'm not the only weary person. I am Zoom fatigued. I am distanced. I assume that's not just me. Some of us are just getting by as best we can as we try to faithfully respond to the intense challenges and disruption in ministry today and life in general. So yet in the midst of all this, I see glimpses of God's grace. And in my church's digitally accessible worship, I see glimpses of God's grace. In seminary worship services that are digitally accessible, I still see glimpses of God's grace. So worship today is nothing like we could have imagined it just over a year ago. Yet by God's grace, we've been and will continue to be faithful in our efforts to lead God's people in worship. We've witnessed these ancient worship practices being brought to life in new digital wineskins, new liturgical wineskins. Even this event is nothing like Dean Tanner and Dr. Taylor and I had originally planned way back in 2019. Yet by God's grace, here we are, perhaps weary, perhaps scarred, perhaps excited for what's next, but most importantly, faithfully exploring new possibilities.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Andrew. To just add to what Andrew said, in God's timeliness, the work that we had done on the committee helped us not to make this hard turn not so hard. We originally wanted to make sure that we could connect our extension campus, our alumni, and our constituents in worship in a way that would be meaningful and effective. And because we had done the work when the pandemic hit, it wasn't such a hard turn for us because we had to immediately go into doing digital worship. And he's right, no one thought about Zoom, but because of Zoom, and because we thought it was a very complex thing, we spent hours in conversations and, as he said, bringing in consultants because we just wanted to make sure that we knew every aspect of how it would make the experience meaningful. And then the pandemic hit and we realized that we had to make a change very quickly. And so we were grateful that we were able to transition because of the prior work that we had done, because of the Vital Worship Grant, to bring our community together for times of prayer and preaching and even ritual. And so it turned out that it was a timely endeavor on our part, but we believe also it was God's timing that helped us to be prepared to be able to bring to our students even now the kind of worship experiences that are meaningful to them. And so we are indeed grateful that we have received the Calvin Vital Worship Grant so that we got a head start on this. And we're also grateful that now we are able to share with the broader community what we have learned. And in today's session, we do hope that we can share and hear from others so that going forward, even in this strange atmosphere and environment of worship, we will still be able to do what we call to do in worship, and that is to bring adoration and to lift our praises unto God and to be able to fellowship with one another.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Weimer. Thank you, Dr. Taylor. Thank you all who have been a part of this grant.